Great. Well, this is the Crowdz Invoice Exchange. We are in a private pilot mode right now, which means we're soliciting information, feedback from our early customers and any others who happen to be viewing this presentation. We'd really like your feedback. We're in the state of the application development where we're making upgrades on an almost daily basis. And so any feedback that you give us will be taken into consideration and probably integrated into the system in a very short order. And so we're in a stage now between the development stage and the final release, in which we're finalizing some of the features of it and adding new features. And so we're looking forward to seeing what you think. In order to give a preview to what I'll be showing on the demo here, I want to explain that there are 3 roles in the system. There's the role of the seller, who is the party that both sells products and services and issues invoices, and also sells invoices for funding in the way that Payson described. There's the buyer, who is the customer of the seller, who buys products and services and who pays the invoices. And then there's the funder, who is the party that funds the invoices, buys the invoices and funds them, so that sellers can receive the early payment of funds like Payson described. So I'll be walking through the various roles here so that you can see how the system works. And I will be starting with the seller. This is a seller's dashboard here. You can see the name of the seller, which this is not a real company. We just use this for testing purposes. And you can see that they have money in their Crowdz wallet that Payson mentioned. So the process for using the Invoice Exchange typically starts with the seller. And the seller uploads an invoice. And so there are a number of different ways that it can be uploaded. We're going to do the upload of an invoice that's already been created, so the basic details are input into the system, and then the actual invoice is uploaded. The first thing the seller does is to select the name of the buyer. And this is the buyer that we're going to be using here for purposes of demonstration. So because the buyer is in the seller's buyer directory of a buyer that it already does business with, the information is automatically filled into the form. And then the seller has to input just a variety of other information here. So the seller has to input the name or the number of the invoice, upload the invoice file, select an invoice date, select the due date of the invoice, and enter the currency and enter the amount of the invoice. I'll use a low amount to conserve the money that we have in the bank account there. So once that information is input, the seller can then add that to be uploaded. We'll upload another invoice here with the same buyer and go through the exact same process again. And we'll make this a shorter term invoice. And upload that as well. So we have 2 invoices that the seller is interested in sending to the buyer. Now, there are 2 things the sellers can do at this point. The seller can upload the invoices and then send them at a later time to the buyer, or the seller can upload the invoice and send it in one move. What we'll do is we'll upload it to start, and so the invoices are successfully uploaded, and you see they go into the seller's invoice upload table. Now, at this point, the invoices haven't been sent out, but we will now, as the seller, send out the invoice and send out the second invoice. And you can see by moving to here that the invoices, along with a previous invoice, have been submitted. Now, the seller can withdraw the invoice if it wants, meaning it takes it back, and then that invoice goes into the seller's withdrawn table, but we won't deal with that right now. We'll just have the two invoices that were just uploaded. Those have been sent to the buyer. Now, before anything else can happen with the invoices, the buyer has to approve it. So we go to the buyer's portal and we go into the pay invoices section, and we see that they've received the two invoices we just sent. Now the seller can reject, or the buyer can reject the invoice if it's not appropriate, if it's not the right amount, the right products, or even if the products weren't ordered. And so instead of doing that, however, the buyer is going to approve both of these invoices. And so those two invoices are approved. And we can see, if you go here, that those two invoices are approved. Now, the buyer could pay those right now if the buyer wanted to, but we won't have that happen right at this moment. So we will go return to the seller's dashboard, and we can see by going to the seller's dashboard that these two invoices have been approved. And so the seller now has the opportunity to sell those invoices to a funder. If we go to the sell invoices tab, we can see that these top two invoices that have just been uploaded, sent to the buyer, approved by the buyer, in return the seller's been notified that the seller can post those for sale. Now, before the seller does that, let's return to the buyer for a moment. And let's say that the buyer wants to pay this $100 invoice. So the buyer clicks to pay, selects the account to pay from, and selects the method of payment. The seller's name is automatically added to the payment form, and clicks to pay now, and then approves the payment. So the payment has been made. And you will see that that invoice has now disappeared from this table. And if we move here, we see that it exists on the paid invoices table. Now, if we move further, we move over to the account table. We can go into the account activity form, and this is where we go to the correct account. We'll see that $100 has been debited from the buyer's account. That's because they paid the invoice. So now if we return to the seller, and we'll come back to this screen in a moment, but if we go to the seller's account activity table, we'll see that the seller has received $100 for the payment of the invoice. So that's how the payment of an invoice works. Let's return, though, to the activity of selling the invoice. Now, you'll see one other thing. You'll note that previously we had 3 invoices up here that were available for sale, one that was there previously, and then the 2 that we just had uploaded, sent, and were approved. One of those has disappeared. The reason that that has disappeared is that that invoice was paid. And in fact, if I went to that table, which I won't right now, you could see that the invoice has indeed been paid. But there is this one other invoice that the seller can now post for sale and get early cash for it. So the seller chooses to do that. First thing the seller does is choose the type of sale. Right now, we have 3 types of sales. A public auction, which is an eBay type auction, where you have multiple bidders bidding in sequence. A closed auction or blind auction, where all of the funders bid wants, irrespective of when and what the other funders are bidding, and the seller chooses the bid that the seller wants that's most favorable. Or the third type is a direct bank sale. This is a type of relationship where a seller has a pre-existing banking relationship with a financial institution, and the seller posts invoices solely to that bank's portal, and the bank can choose whether or not to buy those invoices. There isn't a bidding process. The bank just makes an offer, and the seller either accepts or rejects it, or in later stages of the application, they can undertake an online negotiation. So those are the three kinds of sale activities that the seller can take with respect to an invoice. We will demonstrate the auction, which the direct bank sale works the same way, except there's only one participant. But we'll take the auction path. We'll set a close date for the auction. Let's say the seller wants a quick auction, so they'll set it for tomorrow. They can set the amount of the auction or the discount, meaning the amount that they're willing to take less than the face value of the invoice. Now, this is a $200 invoice, and so the seller has entered a default value of a 10% discount, which means the sales price would be a minimum of $180,000. We'll accept that. We won't change the default, and we'll have the seller will post it for sale. So the seller successfully posted the invoice for sale. We go then to the auction sales here, and you can see that the invoice has been posted for sale. Because it's just been posted, there are no bids, and therefore no discount being offered. So there's nothing the seller can do at this point but to wait. And so now we turn to the funders. We'll go to one funder's portal here, and we go into the available invoices that are available for auction. And you can see that this is the invoice that the seller just posted for sale. There's no high bidder, as we saw, no bids offered. So and we can see here on this particular invoice that the minimum bid is $180,000, $180 rather. So the funder can now decide to bid. So let's say the funder wants to get tricky and bid only $175, even though that's not the minimum. So the seller bids, and their bid is rejected because it's less than the minimum bid. And so the funder has to try again. Let's say this time the funder decides to bid the $180. The bid has been placed successfully. So this funder, if we go back to the seller and refresh the seller's screen, we can see that there's been one bid. And so the seller looks at this and says, well, that's not quite what I was hoping to get. So the seller doesn't take any action at this point. Another funder enters the picture. So we'll go to that funder, and that funder goes to the available invoices for auction. And we see that there is one bid on this latest invoice of 10% discount. So the seller decides, or the funder decides, well, I think I can pay more than that. So the seller decides to offer or to bid $190. And so that bid is placed. And you can see now that the funder in question, the high bid belongs to the seller. It's a 5% discount on that. So that's a considerably better offer for the seller. So the seller goes in and now, refresh the page, sees that there's another new bid and this one looks like it's a better bid. So the seller goes in and decides that they will accept this bid. And so the bid is accepted. That bid, that invoice disappears from the auction sale and moves into the completed sale, completed auction sales. And you can see here it is. Let me actually need to refresh the page. And so that invoice is right here, the one that was just accepted by the seller. And the seller can go back in if desired and view the bids to see what they were, but the bid has been accepted. So now the funder who made that bid has now been notified that the sale is completed. And there it is right here. The sale has been completed on that invoice. And now the seller has the obligation to fund the invoice. So here's the invoice under the invoices to fund table. The seller decides to fund the invoice, which means to pay the seller, and goes through the same process as we saw before. Funds the invoice, and the invoice has now been funded, as you can see up here at the top. So let's see what happens when we go back to the seller. We can see here that the invoice in question has been funded. And now if we go into the seller's account activity screen, we'll see that they have received $190. So they've given a discount on a $200 invoice of 5%. They've received the $190, or the 95% payment, immediately. So that's all that the seller has to do. The seller's work is done. And then we go into the last step. The last part of the process is that when a few days or weeks later, depending on the term of the invoice, or perhaps even months later, the buyer gets a notification that says your invoice is due. And so we go into the buyer's portal, and we go into the unpaid invoices, and we have this invoice here that has $200 due on it. So notice that the buyer has to pay the full amount of the invoice. And so what happens here is that the buyer pays the invoice, they select the account and the method. Now this says that the payment is going to the seller because the relationship is retained with the seller. In this particular instance, we'll have a variety of different legal structures that are implemented. But in this case, the buyer decides to pay the seller. I mean, the payment goes to the seller and the payment is approved. We see now that this invoice has been paid. And if we look at the buyer's account activity, for the other account, we'll see that the $200 has been debited from the buyer's account. Now, what we saw was that the money was actually paid to the seller. And so what we're going to do is we'll first look at the paid invoices of the seller, and we see now that this invoice has been paid. So let's look and see what happened to the seller's account activity. We can see that two transactions took place here. First of all, the money was sent to the seller's account, but the seller never saw that money. That money was immediately sent to the funder. And so the buyer makes the payment. That's routed for administrative and accounting purposes through the seller's account. but it immediately goes to the funder's account. And so the funder's been repaid, the buyer's made the payment, and as we saw earlier, the seller has received the payment for the invoice days, weeks, or even months ahead of when the seller would have received it. And so that is the core of the system and the way that it works. And I will return the floor to Steve so that he can take any questions you might have.
Thanks, Kevin. That was fantastic. Appreciate it.